talk things over. We use group facilitation in our online training programs. Matt, do you want to speak to that? You've had more experience with it.
Sure, I'll touch briefly on it, and later in the presentation, we'll circle back on that point. But as Dan said, the approach we're working with is more of a cost-effective and scalability strategy, because we understand that there are benefits to a group or a department that develop when you have many people using the terminology and working with the concepts of EI. Again, that can be in their own terms, their own words. But the key is that you create a group norm where people are starting to talk about the quality of their interaction with one another and things like whether or not they're trusting of one another. And that really gets people across certain thresholds in terms of teamwork and creates higher performing teams. And Dan, I welcome you to speak to employee retention issues specifically.
About the bosses you've had over your career, and the ones you loved, and the ones you've loved are very strong in emotional intelligence, most likely, and people, bosses, they hate. So it has to do with retention. And the second question, let me just speak to it before I turn it over to you, Matt, which is one of the important things of working well in any difficult situation. For example, colleagues who have only political backing but aren't really good at what they're doing, is in how you manage your internal response. You know, do you stay balanced? Do you stay calm? Do you stay clear? Because that gives you the advantage in terms of how you can work with anyone or with any situation. Matt?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that overlays both of these questions in terms of how they're linked, which is that if you look at what's important for employee retention, and also question two, what might be helpful in making you more effective at working with someone who's, as this question says, has their job because of political connections rather than domain expertise. In both of those situations, you have a case where you have individuals who need someone to connect with them around their needs and interests. And that's not to say that you need to engage in a totally one-sided relationship, but it's a good starting point to extend an opening to them to engage in a level of how you can do things that are beneficial for their effectiveness. If it's a new employee, you want to make sure that they feel heard, that their questions are answered, they've been properly onboarded, but also that they feel like there are people in the organization who care about their success there. You move on to having peers or superiors that are really politically motivated and either don't understand what a domain expert knows or just not that interested in it. Again, they still have interests, and simply knowing that people are there to work with them in a cooperative, collaborative manner oftentimes is a good starting point to getting you to a functional relationship. And in the workplace, sometimes that's all we can hope for, but certainly if they're more trusting of you, they might be creating less roadblocks for you in the future, which is a good starting point to focus on.
There's a few questions here I was hoping to tee up with you, Dan and Matt. I think they're rather interesting. One focused on empathy. How do you train empathy when someone more or less is lacking it?
You know, when it comes to training in this area, I've always said the first question is, do you really care? You know, if someone lacks empathy and doesn't care that they lack empathy, I don't think you're going to get very far. But if someone feels that they're deficient in empathy and is actually motivated to try to improve it, one of the best ways is giving feedback. Having that person, there are many different exercises to use in training and development, but having that person make their best guess about what someone else is feeling or thinking, and then being able to check it out. Matt, what would you say?
I think measurement is an important point to look at, because a person who may say that they don't care or they don't seem to care about empathy would actually still care about their own success and effectiveness. And so using a tool like the ESCI that Dan mentioned earlier, that's one example where you can give them some third-party data points about how they could become more effective. if that is in fact the only thing they think that matters to them. Starting from there, that encourages a person to understand more about what empathy is and understand that actually showing up as empathetic with other people will help them in their effectiveness. In my research, I did actually encounter a limited number of leaders who told me that very experience was instrumental in helping them along the path of becoming more empathetic, because they actually realized they needed to learn how to become empathetic. And they followed a format of literally, what's the definition of empathy? What are things I can do that will make the people I work with feel like I care about them and I'm interested in them? And that was just their starting point. And honestly, their motivation was somewhat self-serving, but over time, it still guided them towards understanding what true empathy looks and feels like.
Let me add something to that. I just saw a question flash by. Is too much empathy bad for a coach? And I think it depends on what kind of empathy. I mentioned that cognitive empathy is one of three kinds, and there's emotional empathy, where you pick up what the other person is feeling. This is the part that can either create amazing rapport or overwhelm you if you're dealing with people who are distressed. This is a big problem in helping professions like nursing, where people get emotional exhaustion because they pick up the pain and suffering and fear of the patients they deal with, and then they burn out and quit. The answer there is to metabolize the empathy, to be able to handle your own emotions. And that has to do with the self-management abilities, particularly that resilience we talked about. And the third kind is empathic concern, which means you actually care about the other person. It turns out that also is a way to buffer the ill effects of being so-called overly empathic.
So the question around self-assessment and emotional intelligence. What is the best methodology for doing this? That kind of narrows, or that kind of removes the 360 from the equation. So if I wanted to know where I was with my own emotional intelligence, what I'm lacking, what I'm missing, how do I go about doing that?
Well, I think you could ask other people. You just may not utilize a formal 360 methodology or product or instrument, but you certainly could ask other people and show a sincere interest in their feedback as a great starting point.